I remember that morning as a slow unveiling, Oxford shrouded in a fog that softened the angles of the old city, muffling the clatter of early trams and the hurried footfalls of students already late for lectures. St. Aldate's was washed in a kind of grey that made the gas lamps seem ornamental and unnecessary, their dim light barely more than a hint against the damp. I walked past Blackwell's, pausing for a moment at the polished window, the scent of leather and dust curling up through the glass, mixing with the wet aroma of stone and rain-soaked cobbles. It was the kind of morning that encourages introspection, that makes one notice the small fissures in the familiar, the half-forgotten echoes in the rhythm of the city. Lewis had rung early, his voice clipped with officiousness, asking whether I would be at the station for a minor matter of stolen bicycles. I told him I might, but that I needed a longer look at Blackwell's, though not for any obvious reason. There is a rhythm to mornings like this, a cadence that carries its own subtle suggestions the way a newspaper flutters under a lamp-post, the faint scuff of a delivery cart across uneven stone, a pigeon taking off from the library roof. It is in those details that I often find the first flicker of something more significant than it appears. The newspaper clippings left by the store's small scraps, anonymous notes with a curling elegance caught my eye. One referred cryptically to a trouble above the balcony, words chosen with care, perhaps even a smile behind them. I traced the outline of the balcony, its ironwork dark and moist, imagining a figure standing there, reading, pondering, perhaps waiting. It seemed incongruous that such menace or worry should attach itself to such an ordinary place, yet Oxford has a way of wearing its secrets lightly, as though they were embroidered into the fabric of the streets. I noticed the way the fog thickened in pockets, hugging the corners of the college gates, and thought, not for the first time, about the quiet opacity of human intentions. A professor passing by glanced at me with mild recognition, but it was his eyes rather than his greeting that lingered. They seemed to ask, perhaps without awareness, if I had noticed the minute discrepancy in a ledger or the subtle tilt of a letter left carelessly on a chair. I had, of course. I always notice. Inside Blackwell's, the smell of old pages was stronger, and I allowed myself to inhale it, slow and deliberate. There was a ledger at the front desk, leather-bound, with pages that curled slightly from moisture. The penmanship of each entry suggested care, but one date seemed slightly misaligned, as though the writer had paused mid-thought. I remembered a crossword clue from a Sunday paper, the answer lodged somewhere between metaphor and reality. It was an idle connection, perhaps, but it stayed in my mind, fluttering at the edges like the wings of a small, persistent bird. I moved to the balcony, tracing the railings with my eyes. The iron was damp, the paint chipped in a pattern that suggested years of unnoticed wear rather than sudden vandalism. Yet it is often the unnoticed that matters most. A shadow beneath the awning seemed oddly placed, a line of soot perhaps, a residue of some careless moment now fixed as a permanent mark. The city was quiet, the fog and rain swallowing the usual chatter, leaving only the sigh of stone and the occasional murmur of wind through narrow alleys. It was the perfect stage for secrets, if one had eyes willing to look. By the time I left, I had not spoken more than a few words aloud. Lewis would be waiting for me to report on nothing and everything. The fog clung to my coat as I walked back along St. Aldate's, the day slowly stirring. Even now I remember the precise quality of the damp air, the way it pressed against the ears and the back of the neck, how the city seemed to lean in slightly, as if anticipating that something subtle and wholly human would unfold just beyond the eye's reach. The visit to Blackwell's that morning seemed almost inevitable, as though the city itself had nudged me toward the worn wooden door and the smell of books that had accumulated dust through centuries. Inside, the air was warmer, tinged with the faint acidity of old paper and the subtle perfume of varnished wood. Marjorie Talbot was arranging a stack of pamphlets near the counter, her hands steady, almost rehearsed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity at my entrance. She did not speak immediately, as though she had learned that silence often allowed the world to speak more plainly than any conversation could. My attention was drawn at once to the balcony, the source of the minor intrigue suggested by the cryptic notice. There, wedged neatly in the ironwork, was a small envelope, its edges curled slightly from damp. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, yet unconventionally angled, as though the writer had paused to consider each letter, each space. I reached for it, noting the subtle weight, the faint impression of a seal that had been removed. There was no return address, no overt hint of origin, yet it carried a quiet insistence, a summons for thought rather than action. I allowed my gaze to wander while I handled the envelope, observing the ledger at the desk. Its pages were dense with transactions, meticulous, yet one entry drew a hesitation from me. A date was misaligned, not dramatically so, but enough to suggest a pause in the scribe's thought. Perhaps it was nothing, a small oversight. Yet it reminded me of a crossword I had struggled with the previous Sunday. The answer had seemed obvious, yet an ambiguity lingered, a tiny letter that altered the meaning without announcement. I recognized the similarity in this envelope, in the gesture of its placement, a subtle message, poised between revelation and concealment. I turned to Marjorie and inquired gently about the letter. She mentioned having noticed it only that morning, her eyes briefly flicking toward the balcony as though it contained more than mere iron and rain. Her voice was calm, yet I detected a hesitation, a slight pause before each answer, like a careful musician weighing each note. Small things, often overlooked, are the beginning of understanding. I asked if anyone else had been near the balcony, and she admitted a couple of scholars had lingered earlier, debating a recently acquired manuscript. The mention of the manuscript made me recall a misquotation of a classical line, one that had been a minor irritant in a lecture, yet now, within this context, seemed to breathe with new potential. I placed the letter on the counter, considering the architecture of the space. The balcony itself was narrow, wrought iron etched with age, and there were scuff marks on the floor that suggested more than ordinary passage. Not all footprints align with intentions. Sometimes they betray them. I found myself tracing the path from the staircase to the ledge, imagining the hands that had positioned the letter, the thought behind each movement. There was a care here, a deliberation that suggested respect for the observer as much as concealment from the unwelcome. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, the light dim and diffused, turning the interior into a space apart from time. The city seemed to hold its breath, and I felt that quiet in my own chest, a rhythm of expectation that could not yet be named. Each detail, the ledger, the tilt of a page, the misaligned date, the envelope itself became a constellation, connected by the invisible lines of motive, habit, and subtle intention. Marjorie offered tea, which I declined, preferring the company of thought to that of warmth. My eyes lingered on the envelope once more, its presence both trivial and profound, like a note in a symphony barely audible, yet indispensable. I left without reading it, carrying instead a sense of the deliberateness of human acts, the layers of meaning hidden in gestures small and considered. The morning outside had thickened. St. Aldate's was awash with the same fog that had made my walk earlier feel like a passage through memory. And somewhere, above the street, the balcony waited, silent, patient, a witness and a messenger, promising that the day would not pass without observation and reflection. It was in the quiet of the college cafe, the kind where the clink of teaspoons against saucers seems louder than the conversations, that I first sensed the shape of the puzzle taking form. The air smelled faintly of boiled coffee and damp wool, and the high windows were streaked with condensation from the morning drizzle. I had chosen a table near the back, partially obscured by a bookcase that held texts on classical history and philosophy, the edges of their bindings softened by decades of hands, some attentive, some careless. There was a low hum of students and dons, punctuated by the occasional laugh or cough, but beneath it a rhythm persisted, subtle and persistent, like the undercurrent of thought in an undisturbed mind. Quince entered shortly thereafter, his gait deliberate, the angle of his shoulders suggesting habitual calculation rather than casual posture. He greeted no one, and as he seated himself opposite an empty chair, I observed the way his hand rested on the tabletop, fingers slightly splayed, thumb tapping a barely audible staccato. It was nothing remarkable, or it might have been nothing, yet I made a note of it, the same way one notes a comma. In a manuscript it can alter the sense of an entire sentence, and perhaps, in due course, a truth hidden in plain view. A conversation between two scholars caught my ear. They spoke in measured tones about a recently published article, its subject a disputed interpretation of an obscure Latin text. One of the speakers misquoted a line from Virgil, the misquotation subtle enough that an ordinary listener would not notice, yet to me it resonated like a chord struck slightly sharp. I recalled an earlier note in the ledger at Blackwell's, the misaligned date and the careful placement of the envelope on the balcony. A pattern, if one cared to trace the faint lines connecting act to act. I sipped my coffee, noticing the faint sediment at the bottom of the cup. My eyes wandered to a newspaper folded beside me. An announcement of a lecture by Hargreaves, one of the scholars connected to the balcony incident, seemed innocuous. Yet the phrasing of the paragraph struck me as a subtle repetition, a word chosen twice in the space of 3 lines, as though the editor had unconsciously echoed a hidden emphasis. One might dismiss it, yet repetition often serves as a signal, accidental or otherwise, pointing to significance. Small anomalies, overlooked by many, form the architecture of discovery. Quince had begun to speak to a visiting student, a question about the proper interpretation of a passage, and I noticed how his eyes never quite met the student's. Instead, they flicked toward the window, toward the vague shape of the balcony above Blackwell's, the same balcony that had yielded the letter. There was a hesitation in the phrasing of his question, a subtle doubling of consonants in the name he mentioned, barely perceptible, yet enough to suggest conscious manipulation. I remembered the misaligned date and the small curl of the envelope's paper, the care with which it had been positioned, and a connection began to flicker into meaning, tenuous but insistent. The cafe's air was thick with warmth and the scent of pages and coffee, yet I felt the cold intrusion of thought, that icy awareness that the mundane often cloaks the unusual. It was a familiar sensation noticing the small details, the gestures, the hesitations, the almost imperceptible anomalies in speech and action, and allowing them to gather weight in the mind. Each was a thread, and the tapestry of the Itiapana, truth, or something approximating it, would be woven only when one recognized how threads intersected. I left the cafe with a sense of momentum, though nothing had yet been revealed, only suggested. The misquoted Virgil, the careful placement of the envelope, the minute gestures, the echoing of words in print, they formed the first clue. Faint and easily overlooked, yet undeniable to one who pays attention. Oxford was quiet that afternoon, the drizzle still whispering against stone and glass, and I understood, with the quiet ache I have long since learned to bear, that the day had only begun to unfold its secrets. The afternoon light was already turning thin when I returned to Blackwell's, the drizzle having slackened to a persistent mist that hung over the street like a half-forgotten sigh. The city had taken on that peculiar Oxford quality, simultaneously vibrant and subdued, as though every step might reveal a secret that had been patiently waiting. I paused at the base of the narrow staircase leading to the balcony, observing the angle of light on the ironwork, noting the subtle variations in rust and paint. Shadows shifted along the wall with each flicker of the gas lamp across the street, reminding me that the smallest detail can suggest more than mere presence, that perception itself is an instrument for discovery. I had come alone, intentionally, because the balcony required a quiet eye, unhurried and undistracted. The railings were damp, slick with condensation, yet nothing appeared amiss at first glance. Then, a subtle line caught my attention, a scuff along the edge of the floor where the balcony met the building, almost invisible unless one considered the direction and angle of the abrasion. It suggested a careful movement, deliberate, not accidental. Perhaps a book had fallen or been placed there, yet the pattern seemed too intentional for carelessness. I noted it with a mental bookmark, knowing that later reflection would assign it meaning. A shadow moved, or perhaps it was a trick of light across the balcony ledge. I leaned closer, squinting at the surface, and noticed the faint curl of a paper corner tucked beneath the iron lattice. I retrieved it with the gentleness of handling a rare book. It was a fragment, nothing more than a corner of a note, but the handwriting, the slight press of the ink, suggested haste and yet care. One might dismiss such a fragment, but I have learned to treat the negligible with suspicion. Small things often herald the shape of the significant. I recalled a crossword clue from a newspaper the week before. The answer seemed straightforward, yet one letter, lightly inked, shifted the meaning entirely. It occurred to me that this fragment might operate in the same way, a minor mark hinting at the underlying narrative. Perhaps a disagreement, perhaps a warning, or perhaps a jest meant only for the eyes of one particular observer. I could not yet discern which. Its presence above the street in that narrow, often overlooked space suggested an intent to communicate in secrecy, but with elegance. Inside the store, Marjorie watched silently from the counter. Her eyes held that quiet scrutiny she habitually employed, a way of observing without intruding. I noted the way she rested her hands lightly on the polished surface, the slight tilt of her head as if the ceiling too might offer some clue. There was no need for words. Her presence was sufficient to remind me that human attention is a fragile instrument, capable of detecting subtleties that otherwise slip by. Outside, the fog deepened, softening the edges of the neighboring buildings. The faintest noise of boots on cobblestones carried differently, echoing in a manner that transformed ordinary movement into a suggestion of purpose. I leaned against the railing, considering the scuff marks, the fragment, the faint lines of rust, and the interaction of shadow and light. Each was a note in a silent composition, an unspoken message left for those inclined to read it. A visitor entered the store, a young scholar with ink-stained fingers, pausing to glance at the balcony as if expecting revelation there. I observed his hesitation, the way he traced an invisible line across the air with his hand, and the slight falter in his step as he approached the counter. Something in the motion suggested knowledge withheld, a thought half-formed but potent. I catalogued it quietly, allowing the details to accumulate, each building upon the other like a musical motif. I left the balcony with the fragment secured, my mind circling the possibilities. There would be time to consider the implications, to untangle the intentions of those who had chosen this particular spot for concealment. Oxford remained muted, draped in fog and whispering stone, yet I felt the faint pulse of revelation lingering just beyond perception. The shadows on the balcony had shifted, yes, but the meaning was still settling into place, waiting for the patient eye to gather its quiet truth. I arrived at the Ashmolean in the late afternoon, when the last pale light filtered through the high windows and the shadows of the galleries stretched long and thin across the marble floors. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint mustiness of antiquities and the muted scent of varnish, a smell that suggests both care and decay. I wandered slowly among the exhibits, allowing my gaze to linger on bronzes, illuminated manuscripts, and the delicate fluting of a Greek column, each object exuding the patient weight of time. There was a rhythm to the quiet, a cadence that made every footstep feel amplified, every whisper of a guard or fellow visitor suggestive of some underlying intention. Hargreaves was already there, speaking softly to a small group of students about the provenance of a medieval codex. Her voice was precise, almost rehearsed, Yet the way she occasionally hesitated, or allowed her fingers to trace the edge of the vellum, betrayed a subtle, unguarded attention to detail. I noted it as one might note the tremor of a string in an otherwise flawless sonata. Her knowledge was impressive, but I was more attuned to the spaces between her words, the brief lapses where she seemed to consider something beyond her audience. The codex itself contained annotations in a hand that was neither Hargreaves nor any known scribe's, faint, almost invisible beneath the lamplight. I crouched slightly, observing the strokes, their spacing and pressure, and thought of the envelope on the balcony and the fragment I had retrieved. The connection was not immediate, yet a subtle pattern began to form, a suggestion that the care taken in presenting knowledge and the care taken in obscuring it could be linked by habit, by temperament, perhaps by intention. A minor distraction occurred when Quince entered the gallery, glancing quickly at Hargreaves, then at me, before moving toward a display of classical statuary. His eyes lingered briefly on a bust of a Roman senator, and he adjusted his coat with the precision of someone rehearsing the image they wished to project. Yet in that gesture, the slight hesitation in the fingers, the almost imperceptible tilt of the head, there was a signal, a fissure in the facade that suggested preoccupation or concealment. I allowed the observation to settle, not pressing it into immediate relevance, but filing it away as one might a bookmark in a long, complicated text. I moved to a nearby case containing fragments of illuminated manuscripts, their gilt letters catching the fading light. The curator spoke in quiet tones, allowing me a brief perusal, and I noticed a marginal note, clipped at the corner, that seemed to echo a line from a lecture Hargreaves had delivered some weeks prior. It was an almost imperceptible repetition, a hint of emphasis, or perhaps a subtle warning. I considered it alongside the envelope, the fragment, the misaligned ledger entry, and the misquotation overheard in the cafe, and the faint pattern began to pulse with quiet insistence. The gallery emptied gradually, leaving only the muted echo of footsteps and the soft, deliberate creak of the floor beneath my own shoes. I lingered near a long case clock, noting the weight of time pressing down, the gentle tick-marking moments both observed and overlooked. Each detail accumulated a glance, a gesture, a fragment of writing. They did not yet form a solution, only a constellation of possible meanings, and the task was to follow their lines without forcing them, to observe without presumption, and to allow subtlety its due. I left the Ashmolean as dusk fell, the city beyond the windows taking on the soft opacity of memory. The evening had offered no answers, only threads, faint but insistent, to follow in due course. Oxford had revealed itself in its quiet, persistent way, and I felt the familiar ache of anticipation, the private knowledge that discovery often begins not with revelation, but with the patient gathering of small, almost invisible truths. I had long suspected that beneath the civility of Oxford's streets and the polite nods in college halls, rivalries festered like quietly burning coals, the kind that one only notices if one pays attention to what is left unsaid. It was in the small sunlit reading room of Corpus Christi that the outlines of one such rivalry became apparent. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and parchment, a comforting scent, yet it carried an undercurrent of tension, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a note slightly out of key in an otherwise familiar sonata. I observed Quince as he leaned over a stack of manuscripts, his posture rigid, fingers hovering over the pages but not touching them, as if the act of reading itself required deliberate self-restraint. He glanced at Hargreaves across the room, a polite nod exchanged that masked a barely contained intensity. It was not hostility exactly, but a calculated assessment of presence, a weighing of intellect and ambition against that of the other. Their eyes met briefly, and I noted the almost imperceptible narrowing of Hargreaves's lips, the tilt of Quince's head, subtle gestures that spoke volumes to those attuned to the language of restraint. A manuscript lay open between them, a contested interpretation of a late Roman text, its margin notes both meticulous and telling. The handwriting differed in ink and style from the printed text, annotations suggesting intervention, correction, and the faintest suggestion of competition. I traced the lines with my eyes, recalling the fragment from the balcony, the misaligned ledger entry, the misquoted Virgil. It became clear that the rivalry was not recent, but layered, historical, cultivated through years of intellectual one-upmanship. Each minor gesture a claim upon authority and reputation. I sipped my coffee, noting how each scholar moved through the room, carefully selecting volumes, checking references, always with the other's presence in the periphery. I remembered a crossword from Sunday, the answer deceptively simple, yet hinged on a subtle pun, and recognized a parallel here, the rivalry, while hidden beneath decorum, contained its own hidden markers, gestures meant to signal competence and claim precedence, but readable only to those willing to observe carefully. Hargreaves spoke softly to a visiting graduate, pointing to a marginal annotation, and I noticed the way she emphasized certain letters, a faint stress on one syllable that seemed out of place in casual conversation. It was almost imperceptible, yet I had long learned that such small details often carry disproportionate weight. In the margin, a note regarding the contested Roman text appeared to mirror this emphasis, a coded assertion that one interpretation should be privileged over another. I filed it away alongside the balcony fragment and the ledger's anomaly, constructing a network of seemingly minor points that, in combination, might illuminate a broader truth. Quince moved to a shelf, retrieved a book, and replaced it with a deliberate slowness that spoke of conscious display. I observed the subtle crease of a page, the angle of the spine, the faint smudge on the cover, each a silent note in the unfolding dialogue between them, a non-verbal debate of priorities, knowledge, and perhaps pride. It was in these gestures, more than in words, that the rivalry was revealed, an ongoing conversation with invisible punctuation and unspoken emphasis. The room hummed with quiet study, interrupted only by the soft turning of pages and the occasional cough. I lingered near the doorway, allowing the tableau to settle, the layers of intellect, ambition, and decorum folding over one another like the careful stacking of vellum sheets. Each movement, each glance, each inflection of voice carried a latent significance, and I catalogued them with the patience I have long cultivated. As I left, the afternoon sun faded behind the college buildings, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The rivalry had been quietly revealed, not through confrontation, but through gestures, annotations, and the subtle weight of presence. I walked away with the familiar sense that knowledge, like the city itself, has its concealed currents, and that the careful observer, patient and attentive, may yet discern the hidden interplay of ambition, pride, and human complexity. The discovery came quietly, without fanfare, in the dimly lit corner of Blackwell's upper gallery. I had returned to examine the envelope once more, allowing the afternoon's shadows to creep along the bookshelves like a cautious tide. The fragment I had found on the balcony had been set aside, but now, laid against a reading lamp for clarity, it revealed what I had not fully appreciated before: a coded reference, embedded within the carefully chosen words, a whisper of intent left for no casual eye. It was subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakably deliberate, a note in ink that trembled with hidden significance. I traced the letters slowly, noting the pressure of the pen, the slight hesitation at a particular curve of a capital Q, the uneven spacing that suggested a pause not of carelessness, but of deliberate concealment. Such minutiae often carry more weight than the bold declarations of speech. I recalled a crossword clue from a Sunday paper, the solution hinging upon a letter barely suggested, and recognized a parallel here. A minor variation in ink, a misaligned mark, might signal more than the literal text. The fragment was a key, though what it unlocked remained tentative and elusive. Hargreaves entered the room, her presence quiet, yet it carried a certain insistence. She examined the manuscripts with the meticulous attention I had come to expect, fingers lingering over annotations, eyes scanning lines repeatedly as if rereading might reveal a truth that had previously escaped notice. I observed her. Pause over one marginal note, her eyes narrowing slightly, a faint curl at the corner of her mouth, suggesting comprehension, perhaps satisfaction, or perhaps the acknowledgement of a secret preserved too long. She did not notice me, absorbed as she was in the quiet interplay of ink and paper, unaware that observation itself can disclose truths beyond intention. I leaned closer to a volume of classical commentary, the spine soft from repeated handling. Within its pages was an inscription in a hand not immediately familiar, a note tucked among other notes, its purpose hidden in the flow of annotations. It echoed a line from Hargreaves's lecture, the subtle emphasis on one word in a sentence that had otherwise passed unnoticed. Here was the deliberate repetition, the quiet insistence, the hidden signal that speaks only to the attentive observer. It was a revelation in miniature. Not a declaration, but a confirmation that someone had been careful, even obsessive, in their concealment. The room felt alive with the weight of what was unspoken. Each gesture, the tilt of a head, the pause of a pen, the careful arrangement of pages spoke to an underlying network of knowledge and secrecy. Quince had also been present earlier, leaving traces not in words but in movements. A slight crease in a corner, the faint smudge of ink where a finger had rested, a hesitant step before moving away from the case. I catalogued these anomalies, allowing them to accumulate, forming a lattice of observation that might one day support understanding. Outside, the light had shifted, the sun now low, casting long bars across the floor, turning dust motes into fleeting, luminous particles. The quiet of the city pressed through the windows, muted by the fog that had begun to reclaim the streets. I considered the fragment, the inscriptions, the annotations, and allowed the implications to settle slowly. There was no urgency in revelation here, only the patient accumulation of details, the recognition that knowledge is often hidden in plain view, discernible only to those prepared to look beyond the obvious. I left the gallery with the familiar ache of anticipation, carrying the fragment and the weight of understanding that it was part of a larger, intricate design. Oxford remained silent, the fog and the fading sun coalescing into a space where secrets might breathe undisturbed, and I understood, once again, that discovery is rarely sudden, but emerges gradually, like ink seeping into parchment, revealing shape and intention only to those who attend with patience and care. The day's work was far from complete, yet the faint pulse of revelation had begun, delicate and insistent, in the quiet corners of ink and paper. The evening had settled into a damp, muted quiet, and I returned once more to the balcony above Blackwell's. The mist had thickened, curling against the walls and obscuring the street below, leaving the city muted and soft-edged, as though it were reluctant to reveal its ordinary motions. I moved slowly up the narrow staircase, my footsteps absorbed by the damp, the faint creak of wood betraying each careful shift of weight. There is a rhythm to such familiar spaces, a cadence in the ordinary that invites reflection, and I allowed my eyes to linger on the balcony itself, noting the familiar curve of the ironwork and the damp spots where the rain had settled unevenly. I crouched, examining the surface, retracing the path of the fragment I had retrieved days earlier. The scuff marks were more telling than I had first realized. A subtle variation in depth and direction indicated deliberate placement rather than mere accident. One could almost read a narrative in them, a story of careful steps, a pause, a shift in attention, the quiet choreography of intent. I touched the edge of a loose board, and a fragment of paper, previously unnoticed, fell gently to the floor. Its corner was worn, the ink faint, yet the alignment of letters suggested an emphasis that I had overlooked in prior observation. Here, in the small and neglected, lay a signal, a whisper of consciousness beyond the surface of ordinary activity. I considered the possible implications. The fragment, the scuff marks, the angle of the railing, each subtlety carried potential meaning. It reminded me of a crossword clue I had solved recently. The answer had seemed obvious, yet the minor shift in one letter had rendered the solution profound in a way I had not anticipated at first glance. Small alterations can carry disproportionate significance, and I felt the faint pulse of understanding growing in recognition of the careful orchestration here. Someone had chosen this balcony, this ledge, for a reason that was deliberate and considered, a communication both hidden and precise. The fog thickened, pressing against my coat, dampening sound, softening the outlines of the nearby buildings. I imagined the hands that had placed the fragments, the mind that had considered each gesture, each movement, each small artifact of attention. Even the tilt of a page or the curl of an envelope can signal intention. It is in these minor acts that the psychology of concealment and disclosure is written. The balcony was a stage, and every mark upon it, every subtle anomaly, part of the performance. Marjorie Talbot had been watching silently from the store below. I noticed the way her gaze lingered on the railing, the fraction of hesitation in her posture, as if uncertain whether observation itself might betray her awareness. It was the slightest of gestures, easily overlooked, yet it told me she, too, recognized the presence of a subtle narrative woven into the everyday fabric of the space. The observer, as often as the observed, carries insight, sometimes unintended, and it is in that shared attention that the truth often begins to solidify. I lingered, tracing the contours of each mark, allowing the quiet to settle around me. There was no urgency, no need for sudden revelation. The balcony, the fragment, the subtle scuffing of wood and iron, all carried their message patiently. I noted the direction of the shadows, the irregularity of the rust, the faint residue of a footprint left perhaps hours earlier, all elements of a composition carefully constructed. They suggested human presence, human intent, and, most importantly, a consideration for observation, a desire that the act be noticed by one capable of discerning it. Descending, I felt the familiar ache of reflection, the quiet anticipation that accompanies patient observation. Oxford had offered no answers, only the accumulation of small truths, each awaiting the proper arrangement into understanding. The balcony had revealed more than it had the first time, not through speech or confrontation, but through the careful, deliberate weight of human action. And I knew, with the quiet certainty that comes from attentive observation, that these small, almost imperceptible signals would guide the way toward a revelation still distant, yet insistently present in the fog and shadows of the city. The day had waned into a kind of hesitant dusk when I arranged to meet the scholars at Blackwell's once more. The store was quiet, subdued, the faint scent of varnish and old paper hanging in the air. The weather outside pressed upon the windows, a light drizzle blurring the outlines of Oxford, softening stone and iron until everything seemed almost like memory rather than actuality. I had prepared for these encounters as one might prepare for a conversation with the past itself, aware that each gesture, each hesitation, each unspoken nuance might carry the weight of revelation. Quince arrived first, moving with deliberate precision, the careful alignment of his coat and the measured placement of his briefcase suggesting habitual control. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on the balcony, then on Hargreaves, who entered moments later, her posture relaxed yet attentive, hands folded, observing the space with a gaze that seemed to assess not only what was present, but what might be absent. They greeted one another with the faintest nods, words unnecessary, for the room had become a silent stage upon which attention itself was measured, and observation the medium of communication. I asked casually about the fragments, the misaligned ledger, and the annotations in the codices, allowing the conversation to flow gently, as though it were a normal exchange. Each scholar responded with precision, yet in both cases there was the briefest hesitation, a microsecond of thought before words were committed, revealing the invisible architecture of concern. Quince's hand trembled imperceptibly when touching a volume, while Hargreaves' gaze flickered toward the balcony in a gesture so slight that it might have been dismissed by any ordinary observer. Yet it spoke volumes to the patient, attentive eye. A visiting student lingered at the counter, consulting a reference, and I noted the angle of her head, the way she turned pages, her attention occasionally drawn to the scholar's gestures. There is always meaning in how others witness, the unconscious ways observation frames action. I allowed the tableau to develop, noting how Quince's fingers brushed the margin of an open codex, and how Hargreaves' lips pressed together in a subtle sign of withheld comment. These minor details, the nuances of movement, began to coalesce into a faint but discernible pattern. A second red herring had emerged. Quince mentioned a supposed errand, a journey by taxi that purportedly placed him elsewhere during a critical moment. It was a statement delivered with careful neutrality. Yet I observed the slight faltering of his tone, the micro-shift in posture, and the imperceptible avoidance of Hargreaves's gaze. I recalled the scuff marks on the balcony, the fragment of paper, the coded inscriptions, and allowed the pieces to intermingle in my mind, teasing apart the weight of fact from the comfort of plausible fiction. The conversation drifted to less consequential matters, manuscripts, lectures, minor academic debates. Yet even here, a subtle gestural glance, a hesitation, a repeated phrase suggested concealed intention. I observed the spaces between words, the breaths taken, the casual alignment of hands and objects on the counter, noting each anomaly and filing it in memory as one might catalogue an overlooked text. The room's quiet, punctuated only by the creak of floorboards and the occasional cough, gave each movement disproportionate clarity. By the time they departed, I was left with a lattice of observations, each one minor in isolation, but cumulatively suggestive of human intention and careful concealment. Oxford, beyond the windows, had surrendered its daylight to mist and twilight, the streets blurred and softened, and I understood that the confrontations had revealed not what was spoken, but what had been withheld. The fragments, the gestures, the misalignments all would form part of the pattern that, once discerned, would illuminate the truth lying just beyond immediate perception, waiting patiently for recognition and careful, deliberate understanding. The morning was subdued, Oxford wrapped in a soft mist that blurred the edges of buildings and softened the sound of distant traffic to a barely audible murmur. I walked toward Blackwell's with a deliberate pace, the quiet pressing against my coat and dampening the usual clarity of the city streets. Inside, the store seemed to breathe with the weight of accumulated hours, the faint scent of varnish, paper, and the damp lingering in the air. The balcony, with its ironwork darkened by condensation, awaited silently above, a mute witness to the movements and gestures that had defined the last several days. I had arranged the fragments, the misaligned ledger, and the annotated manuscripts on the counter, each piece positioned as carefully as a line of thought in a poem. Marjorie Talbot watched from her customary place, her expression neutral yet attentive, a presence that reminded me that observation is seldom passive. I did not need to say the room's quiet was sufficient to convey intent. The objects themselves held a narrative, a sequence of small, deliberate acts, and it was here that understanding began to crystallize, subtle but undeniable. Hargreaves arrived, her expression courteous, yet a tension lingered beneath it. She noticed the fragments and nodded once, as if acknowledging that the puzzle had reached a critical stage. Quince followed, cautious, measured, aware that the arrangement on the counter contained implications that would test composure and perception. Each participant moved through the space with care, aware of the weight of what remained unspoken, the accumulated knowledge that had been gathered in silence, in observation, in the careful tracking of small gestures. I pointed to the fragment from the balcony, allowing its presence to draw attention without commentary. The misaligned ledger and annotations were then considered, their significance apparent only when read in conjunction with the fragment. Hargreaves's eyes flickered to a specific line, the slight raise of an eyebrow suggesting recognition. Quince shifted in his stance, a subtle adjustment that betrayed his awareness of the convergence of evidence. The quiet reveal was not dramatic. It required patience, a mind attuned to nuance, and the ability to perceive meaning in the smallest of signals. The connection became evident in the intersection of gestures, inscriptions, and timing. The fragment's coded reference echoed the annotations. The subtle emphasis in the marginal notes mirrored a misquoted classical line, and the ledger's minor deviation indicated a sequence that reconciled previous uncertainties. I traced each correspondence, each alignment, allowing the room to absorb the revelation through the shared perception of those present. It was a confirmation, not a confrontation, an intellectual acknowledgement that unfolded slowly, with the care of one reading a delicate manuscript for the first time. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows and muffling the city beyond. The quiet held a particular authority, and I recognized the human subtleties that had shaped events: hesitation, emphasis, alignment, gesture. Each had been catalogued over the days, each an essential note in the composition of truth that was now emerging. The scholars, attentive and composed, allowed the moment to settle, their faces registering the understanding without words. Silence, in this instance, was sufficient to convey resolution. As I left Blackwell's, the city's muted contours reflected my own contemplative state. The balcony had yielded its story, the fragments had been read, the gestures understood. Yet there was an ache in the quiet, a reminder that discovery rarely eradicates the lingering shadows of human motive and pride. Oxford remained softly opaque, fog and memory entwined, and I carried the understanding, delicate and precise, with the quiet satisfaction that comes not from declaration, but from the patient recognition of truth in its subtle, intricate forms. The city breathed, and so did the secret that had rested above the balcony, now disclosed, yet still whispering in the mist.